Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Tim Middleton, Product Manager and Retailer Liaison at BookNet. Welcome to Give Them What They Need, a case study of what retailers can accomplish with good metadata. Before we get started, BookNet Canada would like to acknowledge that its operations are remote and their colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, and Vaughan. BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. In spirit of that acknowledgement, I confirm BookNet's and my own responsibility to mend the sacred hoop with Canada's Indigenous peoples, to be an ally to all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to unite and work alongside one another. For our webinar today, if you are having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in the chat, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the Show Subtitle button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have questions for us, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please do be kind, be inclusive, be respectful of others, including their privacy. Be aware of your words and actions, and please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. Do not harass speakers, hosts, or attendees, or record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy. You can find the entire Code of Conduct at bnctechforum.ca/code-of-conduct. Now let me introduce our speaker, Kieron Smith. We're all very excited to have Kieron with us. He's a professional bookseller with over 20 years book trade experience, including WH Smith Retail, establishing the odacars.co.uk website in 1999, heading up the web offering at Bertelsmann Book Clubs in the UK, and operations at Methven's Booksellers, followed by 3 years outside the industry at Europe's leading video games website, game.co.uk. Head of online for Waterstones in 2006-07, and then managing director of international bookseller, The Book Depository, acquired by Amazon in 2011, for 5 years. He joined the UK's leading independent bookseller, Blackwell's, as digital director in 2015 until his acquisition by Waterstones in 2022, where he now runs both blackwells.co.uk and wordery.com. Kieron is also a published author. His book, The Politics of Down Syndrome, by Zero Books, published in 2011, and he has a PhD in organizational democracy from the University of Winchester. Kieron, welcome, and please take us away.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you really for this opportunity to talk about metadata, which comes up too infrequently, frankly. So very, very pleased to do that. And I'm going to take you through what I'm going to talk about today. If I can get this to work. There we go. So I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit, just a very little bit about Blackwell's and kind of the way in which we are approaching bookselling, and then set the scene a little bit more, and then take a step back, I think, and look at some real world examples. And I'm going to pull out some specific titles to share with you, and look at the metadata of those and kind of what doesn't work there. And I'm not picking on any particular publisher. It could apply to any publisher, big or small, actually, but they've just chosen some books that I think are interesting and give a good example of what I'm talking about. And then really go on to talk about the opportunities that Thema offers, because I do think there are many, and I think it's a very collaborative opportunity for the trade as a whole, for publishers and booksellers to be able to create something more than we have now. So without any more delay, I shall go on. Blackwell's has been around for a long time. It's been around since 1879. Obviously, I've not been there the whole time, however long my career history sounded there. One thing that Blackwell's didn't ever do was say no very well. So it has sold trade titles. It became the leading academic bookseller. It's been a very significant mail order player. It's got its own rare books department, second-hand, business to business, and business to institutions with lots of universities as customers, but the NHS, etc. Now, what this has meant is that we've really got a vast range of different customers globally. We've also got some very demanding customers. Certainly, our colleagues, our booksellers in Oxford, have to deal with dons from Oxford University who do expect you to kind of know the answer. In fact, a colleague said to me once, the internet is very useful, but I find it's easier just to know things, which I thought was a great quote from a bookseller. And that's kind of what I think a good bookseller is a kind of repository of knowledge. But our aim is to do two things, I think, really. One is to create selections in shops and to create a selection online that interests and inspires and meets the kind of objectives of serendipity that you would expect from a bookseller. But also it's about discovery. And I think Thema and metadata helps us achieve both things. It helps us create the lists and the selection that we want, but it also gives us the context to help people discover new titles or discover the titles that they want that are related to the interests that they have. I tried to find a picture that represented how I felt everybody is in the book trade, and Buster Keaton ended up taking that role. I think very much this and everything we are doing in terms of structural changes in the business around metadata, around what we do online and how we sell, we're on a moving train already. We're trying to change things as they're already in flight. We've already got sort of big backlists that we always have to deal with, whilst trying to lay the track in front of us at the same time. Now, there are good and bad things to this, I think. One is that although everything is in motion and it's really hard to change anything at any point, it doesn't mean that it does mean that we are the architects of our own future. And I think Thema's been around for nearly 10 years now. It was launched in 2012. And I think it's been gathering steam, just to extend this metaphor. And I think that there are more and more opportunities now for a global meta bibliographic structure, I suppose, that everybody can put into and that can represent everybody's aims around discoverability. When I'm going to sort of go in and then pull back out again, when we talk about Thema, just to go to the real basics, Thema, I think, is often represented as two distinct things, if you like. It's the categories in terms of the traditional hierarchical tree, depicted on the left here in terms of our fiction and related items, fiction, general and literary. Very hierarchical, very structured. We know, we're very comfortable with it. It's something that the book trade, libraries, etc., have all used for many, many years. And then we've got these blobs, these circles on the right-hand side, which are the qualifiers, which are represented often as separate things. But I think actually what's exciting about this is that it's far messier than that, and that it is really needs to be munged together for us to be able to get the real power from this metadata. And as I say, I'll try and bring this to life a bit, because this is also very abstract at this point, and what's useful is kind of visualizing that and explaining it in more detail. But before we go into that, I'm just going to say the words discovery yet again, because I still think this is a huge challenge for the book trade as a whole, whichever country you may be in, wherever you're publishing, whichever audience you want to reach. And I think it's got harder. I had a look actually to see what we had sold as a business online, and over the last 24 months, I've sold over 656,000 unique titles to 115 different countries. That is a lot of there's a lot of different audiences and different interests and different titles in order that people had to discover them in the first place. And some of those, I can flatter myself that as a group of booksellers online, we were able to put things in front of people that they were excited by. But other things people would have found through their own recommendations and things. And I'm going to touch on a little bit later how people do discover books currently, and why better metadata will help feed into that as well. There are a lot of books out there, and we are publishing more and more every week. I've got that quote there from, well, the guesstimate, if you like, from Google when they started doing their scanning back in 2010, that there were around about 129 million unique titles. Currently on our website, we've got around 18 million of those with live availability, which is a very small overall percentage. I think a certain retailer, which I won't say out loud, it's a bit like not mentioning certain characters from certain titles, but have got worse at this because of the sheer volume of product. They've got worse because of the advertising that they're selling within that, and the self-publishing that's feeding into that, and all the different calls on people's attention and on the algorithms that they have within their own search. What's interesting is, of course, we've got another element coming into this quite rapidly, and I think they'll be able to share the link in the channel for everyone in the presentation. But Thad McIlroy published an article last week in Publishers Weekly with the in no way sort of dramatic title, "AI is about to turn book publishing upside down." No presentation at the moment would be complete without a mention of AI. Interestingly, within that article, he says he believes that AI is going to deliver on the till now thwarted promise of efficient discovery. I mean, my fear actually is that it will do quite the opposite, is that we will have more and more chat GPT or AI co-authored or authored titles coming into large catalogues, and if anything, it's going to give us even more challenge about surfacing the titles that we want to surface to customers, and for people to discover things on their own as well. I think the internet certainly changed things. I think it's been a journey away from that hierarchical tree in many different regards. I mean, this is a picture of Blackwell's back when it first launched in 1995, but we've come a long way since then. You know, the cultural context has changed. We're now in a world where this pure hierarchical product classifications are just not sufficient to meet the audience. Themes, niches, identities are core to our experience and the experience of customers, and how we engage in discovery. I think in a way we've got that long tail that Chris Anderson talked about a long time ago, but it's a long tail of niches. And we've got to be able to help customers discover within those niches of interest. But the good news is all this data, all these opportunities, the building blocks are already there. The industry is really, really good about having standards and about using the data and structuring it in useful ways. Thema is a fantastically powerful tool, and I'm not being paid to say this, I honestly believe it. But the industry needs to know the rules and needs to use it to its full extent. It does come down to a point where there needs to be a critical mass in there. And, you know, as I say, back to Buster Keaton, this is a moving train. If you look at blackwells.co.uk today, for example, you won't see lots of use of qualifiers or anything, because those the qualifier use upstream is not sufficient enough for me to be able to surface that content and really share it with customers. We'll go on to show why I think that's really important. Okay, right, into the real detail now. There's nothing like a bit of Onyx to keep everyone awake. Now, this is a really great title, a history non-fiction title looking at East Germany during the Cold War. What have we got in that data? Well, we've got qualifiers, so that's great. So the publisher has submitted some, and we've got Thema subjects. So the Thema subject codes, very much the classical hierarchical tree, and we've got 3 of those in there. Now, the qualifiers really repeat what's in the classification subject tree. So we've got Eastern Europe, which is a little bit of a narrowing down from European history. And then we've got 20th century, 1900 to 1999. We've got some elements in here, Cold War. So it's not bad. It's not in a terrible place, but it could be better. We end up, like most retailers, utilizing at this point the primary classification from the first one on the list, basically. So European history, not great. That's a very large bucket. What the publisher could have done is added some qualifiers to this, utilizing, I mean, for example, you could narrow it right down to the Cold War period using a time period qualifier, and you could even go to East Germany. So you could say East Germany during the Cold War period. As you can see, that's brought us right down. Now, the really fantastic thing about qualifiers, and you think about the way that I kind of put the circles on top of the hierarchy, is if you're interested in East Germany and you're interested in the Cold War period, and you want to look beyond the hierarchy where you've ended up in this history bucket, you know, you may well be interested in philosophers from Eastern Germany, or on fiction, architecture, but they all sit in very different parts of the hierarchical tree, quite correctly. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the qualifiers give us the ability to say, well, actually, I'm interested in other broader things within East Germany, and they can coexist at the same time. And I think this is where it starts to get really powerful, because our interaction with real human customers is that they come in and they say, well, I'm doing a project on East Germany, or I'm reading about Germany, or, you know, what other titles could you give me? And it's, you know, most booksellers, like the quote I had from Peter at the beginning saying, well, I know things. There is only so much we can know, unfortunately. I can probably recommend 3 or 4 titles on East Germany, but actually, if I had access to a load of qualifiers, I would be able to take a list of 20 and then perhaps recommend 5 rather than just the 2 or 3 I remembered. Now, the other issue at the moment is that we find publishers will use the hierarchical tree in order to try and get their books in front of other audiences rather than using the qualifiers. So, and I say, I'm not picking on a particular publisher at all. This is very common. My little highlights moved a bit there, so apologies for that. But if I've taken here part of the hierarchical tree, which is the Cold Wars and proxy conflicts, which is down here. And we've wandered into having a couple of books completely misshelved because that's a non-fiction category. Yet I've got Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy here and a book by Heather Morris as well. Yeah, I can see the connection and perfect for a qualifier, not history titles. And if you wandered into a physical bookshop and found them in history, I think you'd probably question the expertise of the bookseller, unfortunately, standing behind the till. And again, shows the opportunity and shows that there's a desire to have those books there and to reach those audiences, but this isn't the right way to do it. And that's where we start to get into the real power, actually, is to look at these drops of data properly as one big picture in order to connect with people, because that's what we do and that's what the industry does. This is where it gets really interesting. There is a huge amount of demand out there. I mean, I've chosen one tweet here from an author, Victoria Scott, who's written some books featuring characters who have a disability, saying, oh, I'm going to write a letter. You're going to have this demand on Amazon to have a specific category, which, you know, within fiction that has characters with a disability. Great, absolutely. There's a demand for that, absolutely. We'll come back to that in more detail in a second. It already exists, but because it's not being populated further upstream, booksellers, whether they be Amazon or anyone else, aren't able to fill a new bucket or a new lens, if you like, on that data. Now we come to the truth. I've tricked you all to come to this presentation so I can show you a picture of my daughter with a book on her head. So Tansy here, who's kindly posed for me with the Good Hawk. Now she was very keen to have a fiction title with a protagonist who had Down syndrome, as she has Down syndrome herself, and it almost impossible to find. I did ask ChatGPT this question, and it made up some books. It completely fabricated the titles and the authors, which was quite impressive. I'll try to get away with that. Within the category notations for interest qualifiers, if we go into category 5 here, so this is the interest qualifier right at the top, if you can see my mouse, and then we drill down 5PMK, we've got so much detail here that we can actually say relating to people with Down syndrome. And that would have been perfect for this title, because the lead title in lead character, the protagonist in The Good Hawk, is a girl with Down syndrome. You would be hard pressed to find that out from even the synopsis, actually. Somebody asked me, I ran through this presentation with a few of my colleagues as well, and they said, well, is there a concern, do you think, from publishers that you might classify your book in some way that would reduce the audience? And I don't think that is the case at all, because again, if you think about, you've got the hierarchical tree, but you've also got these additional lenses of the qualifiers on top of it. Your book still sits within fiction for young adults in this case, but then there are other interests you can add on top. We'll talk about how many of those to perhaps think about in a moment, but I think it just broadens that scope, because otherwise you're just in that very narrow position. And I've kind of answered that question on there. 5AZ. So this, I've kind of touched on this one, so I'm going to skip over that. Another example, if you were a trainee occupational therapist, for example, and you were looking for books on the accessible design of household objects, you can you'll wander into product design, solid category, such a solid category. It's got 20,000 books in that category. But unless you add a qualifier, you're really going to struggle to drill down on that. there is one relating to people with mobility or physical disabilities impairments. So we're taking a very similar, we're taking that 5 interest qualifier and applying it to a different part of the hierarchical tree, 5 PMB. So we can then start to surface titles like the design of everyday things. I mean, I've chosen one of the qualifiers to drill into a bit with those, the interest qualifiers starting with 5. And I think they can be particularly crucial to the way that books are merchandised and promoted. And I said, by the way, all Y codes, so all children's codes, need at least one A star qualifier, so interest age. So what's the age group that you're aiming at? And if it's an educational title, what's the educational level qualifier? And again, this is far more broad in scope than just saying, okay, well, if I was here, for example, is to say, oh, this book is appropriate for Key Stage 4, because Key Stage 4 means nothing outside of the UK, or even England, actually. But if you've put these educational levels in using the qualifier, it's automatically translated through Thema to the appropriate country's educational level, so that if we get enough of this data, you could be in Germany, or you could be in Canada, or you could be in Mexico, and you could be able to filter based on the correct qualifier for your location. And we've got international diasporas all over the place now who want to know what their particular qualifier would be, and we're not really providing that, and I think we're letting customers down on that front at the moment. Yeah, what's the balance? Because you could also get carried away here and go, oh, it's great for this and this and this, and we see this sort of coming out in different parts of the metadata now. Today I had to delete a subtitle on a title which had been put in to say, this is particularly relevant to, which is not appropriate for a subtitle, obviously. But the right balance, and I'm suggesting here, this is really following the Thema guidelines, sort of maximum of 4 subject codes for a title. Again, you don't want it in too many of these, the standard tree. That's probably what you do now. And then for the qualifiers, probably not more than 6. So just kind of following, think about those audiences and think about how it might be surfaced and used. And I know that's really hard at the moment, because hardly any retailers, if any, are using the full qualifiers or even part of the qualifiers. But I think that's something that, again, we can build together. And I think, again, that's quite an exciting opportunity. I'm talking to a travel publisher here in the UK, for example, and saying, well, actually, if we had all of the very specific location qualifiers available, we could even put their titles onto a map, so people could explore them in a different way and look at it from a geographical perspective first. So what do customers do now? I thought this might be useful to just kind of check back to see what they're doing, because as I've got here, personally, I feel browsing online is pretty underwhelming, because there are so many titles. The filters are not as good as they could be, and I'm totally applying this to what we do as well. There's loads more potential to make that more useful, but a lot of customers do browse. We've got just over half searching for books that they know, not a massive surprise, but browse is up there. It's greater than search, 65%, and we've just repeated this survey data now, because this data was from 2021, and you can see the comparison to 2020. The new data coming in now is almost identical, so that hasn't moved. Now, I can recognize that the graph that's on the right hand side is not very readable. When it comes around, you'll be able to blow it up a little bit. Really, this is asking the question, in the past year, have you bought a book on the strength of, and then people, there aren't many surprises here really, but the top one there is recommendations from a friend, got newspaper reviews, secondhand's an interesting one. I think that's probably people trying it because it's quite cheap. social media recommendations, bookseller recommendations, quite high there at 36%. And then you're into special editions, and I've bought things because they look really lovely. I think because browse is so high, again, this shows the opportunity that we've got to push forward on getting greater conversion, because we can surface the right sort of books to the right customers. And this isn't just an online piece. Booksellers in our shops, in the independent shops that I talk to all the time, are always making lists. I'm in a booksellers association group on Facebook, and you can guarantee every single day there will be another bookseller asking a question. Does anybody have some example titles for this particular customer with this age group, this type of theme? Or I'm not an expert in X. Can anyone suggest some titles? And they just don't have access to this data outside of the tree at the moment. Blackwell itself has quite a few NHS customers, and for them, every single month, our account team will put together, for NHS surgeons, for example, a list of new titles that are very specific to a very expert field. And we have to do that by building up lists from the publisher and looking at AIs and looking at all the data we can find. And again, this would really make that very helpful. Not an internet. Surgeons are not using the internet every day to search for these books. They need us to be able to do that. Super important, obviously, because it literally could save lives. So in summary, really, using Thema well is an opportunity to have better bookshops, giving power to bookshops to use it to serve their customers. There are other spin-offs as well, and I'd be really interested to hear your views in the questions at the end, and just in terms of how you see opportunities, because I will only see opportunities from my point of view, but I think the book trade is far broader than that. One thing that we discovered when we moved some of our bibliodata from one provider to another is that we started to go up the search rankings in Google. And the reason for that, it was just a happy spin-off, we weren't expecting it, was that the data was different. Because if everybody is using the same standard biblio for everything and just presenting it in the same way, so the same synopsis, same title presentation, same categorization and tree, is that Google gets a bit tired of that, actually, and it just thinks, okay, what's another repeat. So actually, I think, again, there's an opportunity here to surface beyond the bookshops themselves into Google and other search engines, where you could say, well, I'm going to filter this as a particular bookshop that's interested in books for children or whatever. And it's to be able to have your own custom hierarchy there. That's quite a lot of work, perhaps, for an independent, but even for the bigger players, there are again opportunities. I'm going to say opportunities and discoverability quite a lot, but I do think it is something that will make quite a big difference to the industry. I've touched on some of the international nature of Thema. We are very international. Sign up on Blackwell's and sign up to our emails and you'll get a sense of that, I think. It's a way, and I've talked about the key stage stuff already, but I think, again, that international perspective would be really enhanced by having the qualifiers in there as well. So I've rattled through a lot of that. On to the last couple of slides. Now, I hope you've got an inkling from my enthusiasm for metadata. Usually when people do come to metadata talks, they're quite self-selected, so I assume that you're probably doing something within the industry in that regard. But it does, as I said right at the beginning, it does need that kind of critical mass. We can all do something about this within our own roles in the industry. I need you to join me in getting new converts to this particular cause, and also in putting into Thema itself. There may be things that are missing. There are national sets. I don't know the Canadian Thema tree or anything like that, unsurprisingly, but you'll be much closer to that, and you'll be able to input and suggest things that can be changed and help it develop, because it's very much, it needs to be organic and it needs to be kind of democratic across the industry, really. So to summarize, Thema is a powerful tool which can enable people across the industry to truly deliver on the promise of delivery. Judicious use of both subject category, 4 if you must, and qualifiers, up to 6, can expand the audience for your titles, or if you're a bookseller, help you find them in the first place. Successful management of metadata on titles is a crucial part of ensuring a title is successful and only going to get more important, especially with AI coming down the road. Thank you very much for your time. I much appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kieron, for that presentation. Really appreciate it. And I'd like to invite a colleague of mine, Tom Richardson. He's BookNet's bibliographic manager and Canada's national treasurer for Onyx data. And so I'm just going to get Tom to join us to provide us with a Canadian perspective on this too. And we do have some questions. So I'm going to feed the first question to you, Tom, and just sort of get you to give a sort of brief synopsis about the North American market and its readiness for Thema, just to help give Kieron some orientation around that for us.
Yeah, it's not pretty. The North American market doesn't support Thema very much, and I'm not aware of any retailer, when focused in it, actually using Thema in it. Now, Kobo might be an exception on that. There is interest, including plans by Indigo. Amazon uses Thema in Europe, but not here. And as usual, publishers in North America are mainly inspired by use, but Canadian publishers are much more likely to support Thema, and US publishers are much less likely. There is good news, and I think this will be changing, as I have heard within committees. Members of at least some of the big 5 US publishers state plans to support Thema in their data here as soon as next year. And I believe most or all already support it internationally. But practically speaking, for now, in a database like BiblioShare representing the North American market, we would have around 15 to an optimistic 20% of the data with Thema. That doesn't tempt retailers, and the lack of adoption by retailers feeds the belief that BISAC is the only option. And it's just as an editorial comment, publishers really do have to lead to gain adoption of anything. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That actually leads really well into the next question that we have here. And I maybe this is more for Kieron, I guess. How much or maybe how little of the market needs to support Thema before you think a retailer could implement a system like Blackwell's?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Really hard to answer. I think in a way, you could have, if you had some significant players, even within a particular, so if you had a group of children's publishers, for example, who really took this on and said, we're going to make sure that all the age qualifiers are there in the first instance. And I think it is moving that direction. I can see children's being the leaders in this, actually, and we get to implement those first. And then that would be a really useful demonstration to other people what the value would be. I think because it's a compulsory set, I mean, it's not, despite it being compulsory, obviously it's not fully coming through from everybody as yet. But I think we will see that certainly over the next 12 to 18 months. Which I'm hoping we'll be able to have that live over that period, and then be working with the publishers who aren't doing it to be able to say, well, look, it's a bit sort of like your peers are doing this and you're not at that stage, and that's an easier in. I think within the broad trade or academic categories, that's going to be harder perhaps to get that immediate critical mass. But you only need a couple of the larger publishers to start doing it. You couldn't just have one, obviously, because your qualifier would make you look like a poor bookseller if you started to expose it. But I think within children's it will be a good start.
That's a really good answer. Thank you. Anything to add, Tom? Okay, next question is, what can publishers do? What sort of considerations should they make to improve their Thema to make it work better for you? And maybe it's opposite, what sort of things really make it hard? So I think you've definitely spoken to this, but maybe we want to reiterate it.
Well, putting it in the wrong classification is probably quite bad. That's yes, that's some sort of cardinal sin, I think, for book selling, unfortunately. Yeah, so please don't do that. I think dip your toe in the water and experiment would be good. I have very, very few, I could count on 2 or 3 fingers, publishers approach me to say, I've put some qualifiers in. How do they look from your perspective? Are they useful? I think this needs to be more collaborative. I think if booksellers just say to publishers, you have to do this, and kind of we wave our arms in the air and complain, then I don't think that's going to get us very far. But I think if we start to work together and people see benefits, then, you know, going back to that kind of children's discussion again, it's going to be a self-fulfilling, you know, get better and better, and we can improve it together. So more conversations is probably what publishers can do to start with. And if they're concerned, there are other people in the industry, you know, Thema and Editor, and Tom will be able to say what's about, you know, whether BookNet also would be very happy to help on that front, I'm sure.
Tom, maybe I can just get you to add what you might think some of the biggest obstacles are for North American publishers to make that transition to Thema.
Well, I mean, I think, well, one, the lack of adoption by retailers, which is kind of the big stumbling block. And, you know, the retailers not having enough data, which you know, what Kieron said was all extremely useful. I would just, you know, I think the only thing I could basically do is really stress is that I think both publishers do need to experiment, and they do need to communicate about what they're trying to do to the retailers. So a publisher who's using Thema and, you know, gain some knowledge of it with an expectation of how it might be used should try and take any opportunity they have to talk to a retailer about that, just to let them know that this exists and this should be allow them to do something with it. And that would be probably helpful. I mean, even just documenting a few, you know, key selling points, books, that type of thing, just may help, you know, get them thinking about it a bit more. They want to do a better job, and they don't feel they have the tools. And giving them the better tools should inspire them to want to use them, even if it isn't on a broad base yet.
One thing I was going to ask, actually, so one of the pressures coming in here is the sunsetting of the BIC scheme in February 2024. And I think people are starting to feel that's coming a bit closer, and the move to 1x3 as well. Whether or not there is that feeling of pressure at all in Canada around the closing of BIC or any of those schemes.
There's virtually no use of BIC here, so never.
Sure, whether there was an equivalent kind of sunsetting of anything.
Well, no, it's somewhat the reverse. Initially, when Thema first came out, there was an expectation that, you know, there would be an industry shift to it, away from the BISG BISAC subject headings, and instead there's been a re-entrenchment of BISAC, and it's undergoing quite a lot of rapid development to, I would call it, themamize itself to make it more useful, which I don't know, I have private opinions on, which I won't go into here. So there's not a similar sort of thing. I mean, there is the whole transition from Onyx 2.1 to 3.0 problem, which largely we've done. I mean, we have transitioned to 3.0 in the main. I mean, Amazon basically made us do it, and we, it was done. So that part is less of an issue, although the question would be, how good is the Onyx 3.0? It gets down to, like, even when I talk about the maybe 20% of Thema, how well is it done? I mean, there's really not much use of qualifiers here, which I understand was always one of the big problems with BIC, is, it had these potential qualifiers without much use of them and things like that. And I can certainly see all that in the Thema here, that we don't make as much use of Thema as we do. And maybe just to you as a professional, you might think some of this stuff looks like somebody did a database, crosswalk between another subject coding system. You can go online at the BookNet Canada website and actually get a BISAC to Thema crosswalk. So, and that often is what drives the Thema use here. So.
Great. That actually did answer a question that we had further down. So, way to go. Way to read the minds of the audience. Our next question is, in addition to Google ranking Blackwell's higher in search results, was there any other surprising consequence of adopting Thema, Kieron?
I mean, it certainly helped with our sort of manual lists. I mean, I think the sad thing is, I think we've only sort of tapped 10% of its power at this point. So I'm more in anticipation of all the exciting things that will come down the line if we can persuade enough people, enough publishers to kind of join us on this journey. In a way, what's quite helpful is that being bought by Waterstones means that now I'm working with a broader set of colleagues across a broader set of retail brands in order to take this forward. And that is the plan, is for Waterstones and for Foils and Hatchards and all the other companies in the group to kind of get behind the opportunities in Thema, and that gives more power to my book selling elbow.
Can I ask what other things you expect to see?
I think, I mean, it's very much a collaborative piece with other booksellers and my colleagues, in terms of, because what I love about them is that everyone's got their own different passions, and they'll come up with great ways of using it that I won't see. I mean, and that's the kind of exciting opportunity there, I think. So I'm expecting to be surprised. Is the answer to that.
That's fair. We'll have you back.
Perhaps with a group of my other booksellers who can say, and there was this.
Our next question, can you speak to the value of other metadata elements such as comp titles, excerpt, table of contents, author biography, series description, EPUB accessibility metadata, prizes, awards, and more? Will this metadata be shown on your website?
Well, I mean, all metadata is hugely important. I think different websites will value different sets of metadata in different ways. I could have spent an hour talking about how important jacket images and dimension data is. Actually, you'd be surprised how poor dimension data can be. And for an online retailer, that's super important for me to know what size packet is going to go in and how much it's going to cost me to post it, let alone things like synopses. Things like excerpt tables, we use some of that more within the academic set, unsurprisingly. So academics are very interested in that. So again, I think it's kind of being a good bookseller is looking at the metadata that you have and then tailoring that for the particular audience that you want to. You don't put too much in front of a trade buyer, for example. If you're buying romantic fiction, I mean, I'm generalizing, but you don't necessarily want to busy the page full of lots of things. You might want to read the first couple of pages, and we've got accessible extracts on the website for a lot of trade titles now, at least 1 million, I think, and that's really useful. What we found is that they're particularly favoured by science fiction readers for some reason. Often in a series, they want to read the first couple of pages. And debut authors, again, that's really, really useful for people to get an idea. So again, it's thinking about the particular audiences and the particular metadata that they might find helpful. We don't sell ebooks, so I can't talk to EPUB, and so we use an EPUB extract for some of the extracts, but other than that, we're analog only on that front.
This is sort of a personal question of mine. It's not on our list, but I'm curious what that process looks like for you to sort of try out supporting new metadata. How do you roll that out onto all your assets? Do you have stakeholders, like a test group, stuff like that? And how long does it take?
Well, actually, we are very, I'm very distrustful of third-party tools, because I like to think book selling is different often, and I don't think the things that we want to do really fit with other retail tools very easily. So we've built a lot of this stuff ourselves. We've built a catalog management system. So actually, we're quite agnostic about some of the feeds that we get. So we would rather get an availability rather than worry about what form of Onyx it's in, for example, and then we will deal with that further down the line. But we're very quick to test stuff and see. So getting the extracts in, if it's our own application, then it's just us having to do it. So we just prioritize on that basis. We are not very, well, I was going to say we're not very good at testing it with the audience. We have quite a vocal audience. I think they let us know quite quickly whether they like things and they don't like things. And we have, the nice thing about being a multi-channel retailer is also they will often come into the shop and say, I saw this on your website, and this is what I thought. That doesn't work for our global audience, obviously, but again, they're very communicative. And that's part of the fun of what we do, I think, and just experimenting with customers rather than kind of selecting and trying it direct and getting their feedback.
Back to the script. Is there any editorializing that takes place on Blackwell's side? Do you ever work backwards and edit publisher data that you feel is missing content? Oh, that's an interesting idea.
Sometimes, but I think the sheer scale of it is difficult when you've got 18 million titles. Where we're featuring something in a promotion, we will sometimes edit data, certainly to clean it up, to make sure that that's not very scalable. I've got 2 content editors. There's only so much we can kind of do in a day. So the more publishers can do to help us along that journey would be appreciated.
Right. Again for Kieron. Oh, this is a question from you, Tom. So you, in describing the East Germany books, did you mean to say that publishers shouldn't mix fiction and non-fiction subject codes? That's coming from Tom Richardson. No privacy here.
You should never put a non-fiction title into a fiction category and vice versa. You can, that's where the qualifiers come in. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy shouldn't be in history. Definitely.
Is that the question?
Yeah, that is, and I think I misunderstood where the Cold War was set.
So Cold War qualifier, absolutely.
Still, it does seem to me that I mean, if the main subject was fiction, then wouldn't it be better to have a toggle that sort of like filtered it? Because sometimes you do wind up, like flavoring, an anarchist sort of technology related sci-fi thing, there might be a technology code that fits it really well and really places it.
I mean, there are always some exceptions. Obviously, I'm being quite, but again, this is where the qualifiers add the real value, I think. So
This is useful for me. I think just the fact that it's very ambiguous, but it's just, it contradicts some of the instructions that have been given to Canadian publishers. So good. I'm glad to hear that. I think that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think of we certainly think of a hierarchical tree, that element of it as physical, think of it as physical bookshelves in a bookshop. To that degree, like I said, you wouldn't go to the history category in the bookshop and go, oh, John le Carré's in here. Although you can see the kind of the thought process that got you there, it's still in the wrong category. Maybe that one's quite black and white to me. I think if you had a set of bookshelves that said the Cold War and all things about the Cold War, which you might put on a table at the front of the store, then that would be fine, and that's your kind of qualifier.
What you're sort of saying is it's more useful to you to have the geography code of East Germany, the time code of like the Cold War period, than it is to have the history marker. That's.
Yeah. I mean, history is an important part of that as well, but those are the things that finesse your kind of where it is in the first place.
Okay, thank you.
And just a sort of spin-off from that, since you referred to shelves in the bookstore versus online, how closely do you align your categorization within your bricks and mortar versus online? Is that just a very divergent?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Okay. I shall write that down because I mean, it varies for us, for Blackwell's, it varies a lot by the bookshop, because some of our bookshops are very tiny. If you go to Exeter University, it's probably not much bigger than this room, but then Oxford, Broad Street is huge and 5 floors and whatever. But each one of those shops is very tailored to its particular market. So I say Oxford is kind of serving the university as much as anything. It will have over the years created classifications in there which are unique to that shop and unique to that audience. I think it's going to be quite different, would be my guess, to the online categories. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know. I'd like to see our online categories evolve a bit more actually over the next 12 to 24 months. Sometimes using Thema, sometimes not, sometimes just using things that we think will be useful categories for our customers.
Thank you. I think it's 2:58. I think we have time for one more question. And I have one more question. So how would you explain why publishers are not investing in an efficient cataloging system and experts, as discovery is not only advertising and marketing? Metadata is not a technical thing, but a marketing thing.
I think definitely whoever's asked that question should shout that from the rooftops. Because I think that's probably
one of yours, Tom.
Probably one of the misconceptions is that it's just part of a technical process rather than being exactly that, rather than being the marketing and surfacing of your titles. So absolutely.
Tom, you want to weigh in on that one?
Well, just to emphasize that it was part of Kieron's presentation, like about the collaborative nature of the metadata between the publisher and the retailer is part of that. I mean, it's not a simple thing. That's all.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have. So thank you very much, Kieron. We hope to have you back again. And thank you, Tom. And I do have to say, before we go, we'd love if you could provide feedback on this session. We'll drop a link in the survey in the chat. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. And lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to all of you for attending. And especially thank you, Kieron. We know it's late. We know you got to get home.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.